There's a big debate in Washington, D.C. right now over possible cuts to a variety of different programs in the federal government. So what does this mean for the federally funded social safety net?
Spending more money doesn't necessarily lead to better results. So a smaller safety net that is more targeted towards vulnerable Americans actually supports vulnerable Americans better.
On this episode, we give you an overview of what's being discussed in Congress, and we explore how to find ways to save taxpayer dollars while also improving outcomes for families who truly need help getting back on their feet. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about upward mobility and opportunity and some of the proposed changes in Washington, D.C. to alter some of the safety net programs, as well as getting into what's happening at the state level and kind of this broader movement of welfare reform that's taking shape more and more across the nation. And to have this conversation, I'm excited to welcome back into our virtual studio here on Defending Ideas, Les Ford. She's a senior fellow with the Alliance for Opportunity and also the president of Ford Policy Solutions. Les, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
We're excited to have you back. I think it was a year and a few months ago that we had you and Rachel Barkley from Alliance for Opportunity on to talk about the Alliance and talk about everything that you all were working on. And so one, I would love to just kind of give an update to our listeners. We'll include the link to that episode in our show notes, but fast forward, almost a year and a half, what's some of the progress you've made? Can you give us kind of just a quick recap of here's what the Alliance is working on, here's some interesting developments that we ought to know about?
Sure. And just for background for the listeners who don't want to go back and listen to the other podcast, the Alliance for Opportunity is a state think tank-led coalition to focus on upward mobility for our neighbors who are low income, who are vulnerable, who are looking for self-sufficiency. So it's a coalition to focus on those goals, and we've recently expanded to a few more think tanks. So I believe there's 5. There's the Cardinal Institute in West Virginia, there's Empower Mississippi, the Illinois Policy Institute, the Sutherland Institute, and the Archbridge Institute. And so it's delightful to really have these state partners come alongside the original 3 state partners, which is Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, because we've really discovered here in DC that while it's lovely to think that wonks up here can solve every issue, you really do need that on-the-ground state-level experience to inform federal legislators. So we're excited to now be an 8-state think tank alliance. And we're also excited to have some pretty substantial wins over the past year and a half. We are a new coalition, but we've really been looking at the issue that we talked about last time, which was the One Door to Work Act. We talked about how there's this massive divide between the safety net programs. Here, think about food stamps or Medicaid, like healthcare for low-income folks, or cash assistance for low-income people. And there's a big divide between all these programs that are intended to help people when they're in a hard spot, and our workforce programs, which are intended to help people move into the next step. So the One Door to Work Act has been trying to bridge these two spheres federally, and we made some good forward progress in the past year. I'd love to tell you more about that.
Well, let me just ask, Les, and I'll preface it with, we at Sutherland, we're of course very excited to be part of the Alliance for Opportunity in this new official capacity. We've been collaborating together for a while now on some various safety net issues, but I just want to underscore something you said, that the importance of states leading out. It is very easy and tempting for those of us, either if we're regular voters or if we work in the policy world, to kind of throw up our hands and say, well, there's only so much we can do. The feds have to figure everything else out. And we've talked a lot on this show and in other episodes about the importance of restoring federalism, that the whole concept of the United States is built on this idea that states should be laboratories of democracy, they should be innovative and responsive to their residents, and better suited to solving big problems. And I think poverty, upward mobility, the social safety net is one of those that that has kind of been relinquished to the federal government for all the reasons that you talk about around the one door issue, that it's sort of under federal control, largely speaking. And so I want to underscore that obviously we're excited about it, but also see the potential for states to lead the reform effort. And along with the other wonderful states that you mentioned, Utah, I think, from my perspective, the benefit of having Utah involved, there are a number of benefits, but the one door model, just to remind our listeners and viewers, is a Utah thing that, Utah has been grandfathered in to be able to essentially co-locate workforce and welfare services in one state agency. And it's all work oriented. There's still some improvements we can make in Utah. But anyway, I just want to underscore that point, that it's states leading out seems really impactful. And to turn that back to a question for you, I guess, what do you see as the impact of that moving forward? So we would love to hear more details about the progress of the one door to work effort in Washington to allow other states to kind of follow a model like this. And why do you think it's had the progress it has had so far?
Yeah, so I want to reiterate that states have to lead out. When we think about a massive uh, reform of any program historically, we really haven't reformed that many programs. Republicans have kind of gotten tax cuts a couple times. Those are our big wins. And the other big win is the 1996 welfare reform, which was state led. It was let out in Utah, it was let out in Oregon, and it was most specifically let out in Wisconsin. Those states undertook reforms. They got waivers from the federal government to look at these major reforms, putting people back to work. And then the federal government, even Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich in 1996, that's when they reformed a program. It had to be the states going first. And I know you've already mentioned the laboratories of democracy, but that's really how it goes. So switching back to one door to work, which you have pointed out, it's really following Utah's model. Utah has a carve out from the current law that really allows the state of Utah to deploy their workforce services to where they're most needed, and really to co-locate their workforce services with their safety net services. So it really is, you come in to one door and you're going to get the help that you need to get back on your feet, or that's the goal. But other states aren't able to do that. So the progress that we've had over the past year is we saw Utah's representatives in Congress really take the charge here. So Representative Burgess Owens on the House side, he introduced the One Door to Work Act. And then on the Senate side, Senator Mitt Romney, who's now retired, he introduced the One Door to Work Act as well. And normally, I always like to let viewers know, this is kind of depressing, but it usually takes about 8 years before a bill is introduced to when it gets passed. We're trying to operate slightly faster here, and we saw some really good progress last year. So not only was the One Door to Work Act heard in committee, and it actually passed the House of Representatives, and then it was heard on the Senate side in a hearing and was included in the bipartisan package to go forward. At the end of the day, in the waning weeks of the last Congress, which ends at the end of the calendar year, essentially, it was included in the continuing resolution, which is how they pass any final bills. It didn't end up passing. You might have seen there was a couple news stories about a 1,500-page bill, and that was eventually trimmed down to just a few hundred pages instead of 1,500 pages. And the One Door to Work Act did fall out. But we're very hopeful that this Congress will finally be able to pass that finish line of getting it signed into law, so that states can take on that important work of making their workforce and their safety net systems actually work for the vulnerable people and families in front of them, because that's the ultimate goal. We need the safety net to work for the people in it.
I want to come back to some of the state-based reforms, and we'll talk in more detail in a minute about some of the things we're pursuing here in Utah, actually, that we've seen some good progress on as well. But let's stay in Washington, D.C. for a moment. There have been some news articles, some coverage around potential changes to safety net programs on the federal level. Talks about cutting spending in various areas. I wonder, can you just kind of give us an overview from your perspective of what's the lay of the land right now? What's being discussed in Washington, D.C. relative to the social safety net?
Sure. So I'm going to back up a little bit. Congress needs to act sometime in this calendar year before the end of 2025 to extend the Trump tax cuts from 2017. This is the driving force that is creating all of this conversation. So those tax cuts that were passed in 2017 that lowered the top rate, that made it easier for small businesses to get going, that really unleashed all of the economic activity we saw during Trump 1, as I'm going to call it from now on, those expire at the end of 2025. So we have to extend them somehow, or we are really going to have a massive economic impact. Now, how does Congress extend it? Normally, in order to extend something like this, you would need 60 votes in the Senate. We don't have 60 votes in the Senate. But there is a vehicle, something called reconciliation, that allows budgetary items to pass with 50 votes, which Republicans have. They have 54 votes in the Senate. So the substance of what we're talking about here is a process called reconciliation. Now, the Trump tax cuts, they bring in less revenue to the federal government. So in order to balance the books, you have to cut from somewhere else. We have nearly $7 trillion annual budget. We are very much in debt. So when you're hearing about cuts, it's in the process of how do we pay to continue the same tax cuts that we have already been living under since 2017. So that's the vehicle, that's the driving force. That's why we're talking about this. Now, what you heard over the past couple weeks is the House budget and the Senate budget. These are the committees. Each released a resolution saying this is how much we want to save in particular committees. And that's why you're hearing about possible safety net cuts. On the House side, they had larger numbers because they want to do it in one big, beautiful bill, as President Trump is calling. On the Senate side, the numbers were a little bit lower because they want to do this in 2 steps. They want to do the reconciliation process twice. They want the first bill to be focused on the border and the second bill to be focused on the tax cuts and everything else they would need to do there. The president is currently endorsing the House side's one big, beautiful bill. So those are probably the targets that we'd like to look at here. Did I miss anything in explaining what we're trying to do?
I think that's a very helpful explanation, especially the reconciliation process. It's kind of wonky to someone who doesn't kind of live and breathe this stuff in Washington. So that's very, very helpful context. I want to ask you about, I guess, run some numbers by you and then kind of get some clarification on these. So this is from Associated Press and Yahoo News online. And we'll link to this article in the show notes, but the news coverage about these potential reductions or potential cuts, they say, so this is essentially the dollar amounts assigned to these various committees. What you're saying, that this is essentially what, as I understand it, what leadership has said, hey, this committee, find a way to save this much money with respect to the programs under your jurisdiction as an appropriations committee. The Energy and Commerce Committee, which handles healthcare spending, is asked to cut $880 billion over the decade, while the Education and Workforce Committee is asked to reduce spending by $330 billion. The Agriculture Committee is asked to save $230 billion. And then I'll stop there because those, I think, are really the 2 main ones that are relevant to what we're talking about today as far as the safety net. That the Energy and Commerce handles Medicaid, correct? And then Agriculture Committee handles food stamps. So is that right, that it's essentially saying, hey, Committee X, figure out how to save this much money? Am I correct that doesn't necessarily mean that the food stamp program specifically or the Medicaid program specifically will have a particular amount of cuts? How they implement those reductions is yet to be decided. Is that right?
Yes. So the reconciliation process is really 2 steps. So the first step is a resolution. It's the chairman's mark that comes out of the budget committee. And it's instruction to the committees of jurisdiction saying, find a way to save this much over a period of 10 years. Now, when we're looking at the numbers you just said, education and workforce, we can put to the side because you could probably roll back the Biden student loan bailouts, and that's about the number that they're looking at. It's not completely the number, but it's about the number. But you're right, when we're looking at energy and commerce, or when we're looking at the Ag Committee, that's Medicaid and that's SNAP, respectively. Now, to the question of whether it's going to be cuts to Medicaid or whether it's going to be cuts to food stamps, with numbers like these, 880 billion and 230 billion, we are looking in some capacity, we're looking at cuts, as you would put them. And it's important to put this in context because since COVID, we've seen massive enrollment in these programs, primarily from able-bodied individuals who aren't working. And so when we're looking at cuts, we're not looking necessarily at cuts to the vulnerable population. Just to put this, I like to put this a little bit in context. So in Medicaid before, I want to make sure that I get these numbers right. So in Medicaid before COVID, we probably had about 75 million people on Medicaid. It shot up to about 98 million people in 2023. And that was because there was a rule in Congress that you couldn't bring anyone off the rolls. Didn't matter any circumstance. But after that was repealed, we're still at 83 million people on Medicaid. And it's important to know that the vast majority of these people are able-bodied adults who aren't working. And so when we're looking at a cut to Medicaid, there's several different ways Congress could go about it, and they haven't specified yet how they're going to go about it. But my instinct is that it would have to look at that population of able-bodied adults without dependents.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a clarification. When you say most of those folks, when you're talking about the Medicaid numbers, the increase from pre-COVID 75 million to now, and it's in the 80 million mark. When you say most are able-bodied folks who are not working, are you saying most of the Medicaid roll entirely, or most of the increase from pre-COVID to now?
Most of the increase from pre-COVID to now. So and we're looking at Obamacare. The vast majority of Obamacare was actually putting people on Medicaid. It wasn't giving them private health insurance. So before Obamacare was in place, about maybe 23% of the program was an able-bodied adult, and now that's 42% of the program. So you're seeing a massive increase. And when we look at people, the percentage of these individuals, about 62% of individuals who are able-bodied and on Medicaid are not working. So these are kind of the numbers that we're looking at. Now and it's important to a further item. If you're a traditional Medicaid enrollee, so you're elderly, you're disabled, you're a pregnant mother, you're a child, the federal government is giving states on average about 57 cents on the dollar for every dollar that the state spends on that population. For the able-bodied expansion population, the federal government is giving states 9 out of every $10, 90 cents on the dollar. They set a higher limit, so states are spending a lot more money on the able-bodied population as compared to the traditional population. That's not great for how we like to envision the purpose of the safety net. Okay, so setting that aside and moving forward to what could Congress do here? They are probably primarily going to focus on the expansion population, this able-bodied, non-disabled, non-elderly, not child, not pregnant population, because that is where they're spending most of their money. I've heard talks of something called a per capita cap on the expansion population, because I've heard as many as 20 states are actually spending more money in Medicaid than in private insurance spends on the same population. So it would say, hey, stop spending so much money on this population. Another reform that they could do is to institute work requirements. So in food stamps, work requirements looks like, hey, you have 3 months to go out and start working, training, or volunteering 20 hours a week. 20 hours a week would be on the high side. And if you don't do that, then you're going to have to move to the private insurance market, the Obamacare market. So those are some of the options. All that could save a lot of money. Other options in the Medicaid space are that states wouldn't be able to provide for non-documented immigrants through the program. All of that could save $880 billion over 10 years. The important to note thing here is we have to protect the traditional population. Switching over to SNAP, we kind of have a similar reality in the SNAP space, $230 billion. over 10 years means we're heavily focusing on the able-bodied adults without dependents in that program too. And maybe even the able-bodied adults with school-age children, so children over the age of 6. Here I kind of want to focus on benefit cliffs, because we often talk about benefit cliffs in the SNAP space. And two of the reforms that I'm hearing about are rolling back the thrifty food plan and rolling back the broad-based categorical eligibility, which I'll call BBCE. Those two, the thrifty food plan and the broad-based categorical eligibility, these are the reasons we're seeing benefit cliffs. A benefit cliff is when someone has a job and they're earning more money, and then they suddenly pass a point of eligibility and they receive a big cut in benefits. Think $500 a month in benefit loss when they're only receiving a couple $100, or maybe not even that, a year in income increases. Now, SNAP wasn't designed to have a benefit cliff. It's supposed to have a slope out at 30% so that you never hit a benefit wall. Unfortunately, in the past 5 years, these two, the thrifty food plan and the broad-based categorical eligibility, are the reason we're seeing benefit losses. The thrifty food plan increased how much you get a month in benefits through your food stamps. And it increased it so high that you couldn't have a 30% drop off on a smooth rate before you hit the final eligibility wall. The other item is the broad-based categorical eligibility, which says if you receive a brochure or a 1-800 number from the TANF program, which is a temporary assistance for needy families, it's a cash benefit program. You don't have to receive cash, but if you receive a brochure from that program, which majority of states, I think it's 47 states offer, then you are exempt from one of the eligibility thresholds, but it puts you directly in line to the other eligibility threshold. So I have heard that the Ag Committee is looking at rolling back the thrifty food plan and rolling back broad-based categorical eligibility, which would actually improve how individuals approach the benefit cliff that currently exist. It would kind of reset the 30% slope. I'm going to do this up on the screen, that folks should be hitting. So those would be positive steps forward. Even though they look like a cut, they make it easier for people to enter into self-sufficiency because we don't see those hard drop-offs.
That's an amazing overview. And you're touching on something that has been on my mind in recent weeks as these discussions have progressed in Washington. An example of this is just recently, the U.S. House Oversight Committee, actually their subcommittee on healthcare and financial services, held a hearing, I think the first in a series of hearings about welfare reform and kind of the growth of the welfare system. And I watched the hearing, and one, there was kind of just a lot of folks giving speeches and less constructive dialogue than maybe you would hope for in that kind of environment, which is not, of course, uncommon in Washington, D.C. But when it seemed like a lot of folks were kind of talking past one another as members of the committee, because there were some who were saying, we shouldn't go and cut, important benefits on the safety net. And then actually the chair of the committee at the end said, the concern to me is less so what these programs cost and more so the outcomes we're getting for them, as far as helping people to actually move out of poverty and move towards self-sufficiency. And that's been a big focus of the work we're trying to do here in Utah and elsewhere at Sutherland Institute on the safety net, is trying to help people more easily and effectively transition off of benefits into work-based self-reliance. And so as I'm hearing these discussions, I'm thinking, well, some people are trying to frame this as, well, either we're just cutting these programs, or we can look at improving outcomes. And I guess I have sort of a two-part argument / question that I'd love to get your guidance on is, number one, if I were approaching it, I would say that the first and most important goal should be to improve the safety net such that we get better outcomes, so that we can eliminate or address the work disincentives that you're talking about, the benefits cliffs or plateaus, or any form of work disincentive, whether it's perceived or actual, that we need to improve the programs so people can transition into work-based self-reliance in a better way. And then maybe secondary is cost saving. So that was kind of my initial thought, is improve to yield better outcomes and remove work disincentives as the first priority, cost savings as the second priority. But it sounds like the way you've described it is it might be a little bit more nuanced than that. If we're talking about ways to maybe trim some spending, the actual mechanism of actually doing that in some of these programs could very well actually align with better outcomes as well.
Yeah. So I think when we're talking in the context of a budget resolution, like we are, when we're talking in this specific vehicle that Congress is taking, we start by talking in cost savings because that is the vehicle we're talking in. But that doesn't mean that by talking, I wish we could talk about it first with, hey, thrifty food plan didn't make any sense. It didn't really help anyone. Let's get rid of that. BBCE is a loophole that helps people who have massive assets get on a program that's probably lending it to fraud. We should roll that back. It's also contributing to a benefit cliff drop off. Hey, able-bodied adults without dependents who are in their 30s or 40s, or maybe they have school-aged kids, we should not just be sending them a check. We should be making sure that they're actively on a path to training, to volunteering, to gaining skills that allow them to support themselves. And that takes the form of a work requirement normally. I wish we could start the conversation there and then say, and by the way, that returns our safety net program, the food stamp program, to its original intent, which is helping those who are low income and vulnerable and hitting a hard time find food security while they do that so they don't experience deprivation. In the context of the vehicle we're talking about, the budget resolution, it starts with, hey, we have to make sure our budgets get in line. So it's kind of a both and where the policies that Congress is going to pursue will make our safety net programs focus on the vulnerable and lead people to more self-sufficiency. But the first part of the conversation is, hey, we have to save money to get this vehicle to go get across the finish line. So it's a hard conversation in um, the way it's approached, but I don't think that means it's a bad conversation to have.
In that case, Les, do we just need our members of Congress and, of course, the congressional majority and leadership to just have talking points that kind of mirror what you just said, that to say that, yes, obviously we're having this conversation in the context of a budget resolution that we have to pass under reconciliation, so we have certain parameters we have to work under. And so that's sort of, as you articulated earlier, that's the motivating force behind finding some significant savings in some of these areas of spending. But is it just a matter of beefing up the message on the other side that this should be one sort of cohesive message that, yes, we want to save taxpayer dollars. Also, and integrated into that, we want to find ways to improve these programs to, again, have these better outcomes. And the families, to your point earlier, that are in genuine need of some stabilizing assistance that the safety net can provide, these folks are hungry for work and self-reliance by and large. And the conversation, we just need to elevate on the other side that, yes, let's trim, let's save where it makes sense, but let's also do so in a way that improves outcomes. And I mean, I'll be the first to say I consider myself a fiscal conservative, and in a massive, sprawling federal system with 80 programs, $1.6 trillion a year, when you look at kind of everything that could be reasonably counted as a welfare program or safety net program, of course, there are going to be ways we can streamline, consolidate, be more efficient and effective, and save taxpayer dollars. I don't want that second part to get missed in the public dialogue. So I guess I'm asking, how do we make sure they're both part of the public discussion?
No, I entirely agree with you. We have to talk about them both at the same time because a safety net that is responsive to vulnerable Americans is going to be smaller. That's just a fact. We see this all the time in the education context. You know, they spend $29,000 per kid in DC, which is right next door to me. The outcomes aren't there. Spending more money doesn't necessarily lead to better results. So a smaller safety net that is more targeted towards vulnerable Americans actually supports vulnerable Americans better. And also, we spend too much and we should spend less. I think there are a couple reasons you're not seeing those talking points right now is the House side right now has a very tight majority. It started with 218, and then President Trump nominated 3 of those 218 to serve in his administration, and so that gives them a one vote majority. So the fact is, it's very close on the House side. It's really hard to pass something like this, and they haven't distilled what policies are going to end up in this package yet. I think as they distill, are we going to be doing thrifty food? Are we going to be doing VBC? Are we going to be doing work requirements for able-bodied adults with young children in SNAP and Medicaid? Then you're going to be able to see, okay, now how do we talk about this? I wish we could reverse the process, but this is kind of the process of coming to consensus, is they have to come to consensus and then they talk about the consensus. They can't sell something they haven't agreed to.
Well, Les, we'll have to keep following this closely because obviously this will continue. Give us just a quick preview, and then I want to ask you about some other broader reform efforts in the time we have left. But before we leave this topic, can you give our folks out there just a quick preview of here's what to expect in the coming weeks and months, here's how the process will work, what kind of timeline should we expect to have more information and kind of maybe some decisions made?
I wish I could tell you exactly what's going to happen. These are all best guesses. Here's what I know. Before the end of 2025, Congress has to pass a reconciliation bill that extends the Trump tax cuts. That is the number one priority of the president. It's the number one priority of this Republican House and Senate. So that's the backstop. We're in February right now. And as I said before, the budget process, it can either be one bill or it can be two. The Senate wants to do two, the president and the House wants to do one. So we know that the budget chairman will send instructions to each of their committees. Both House and Senate have done that. The committees will work on, assemble a package and send it back to the budget committee. The House can pass it then on the floor. I don't know how much time that is. I'm hearing April or May. The Senate can do the same. They're again, remember, they're doing a different process over in the Senate. So they're trying to do what's called a vote-a-rama on the Senate floor. So after the committees put something in the bill goes to the floor, and they basically stay up all night and debate amendments. It's the most exciting time on the Senate side. That'll happen later this week, but who knows if that'll actually come to the floor, or whether the president will sign it. All that to say, a lot is in the air. They have to come to consensus, and they have to do it. They're trying to do it in the first 100 days. They have to do it before the end of the year.
Well, that's a good roadmap for us and our viewers and listeners out there to keep an eye on. And obviously, as things progress, we might have opportunities to discuss this further on this show. Les, in the time we have left, I want to shift back to kind of the maybe some bigger picture reforms. I want to share, of course, some of the things we're doing here at the state level here in Utah. But with the Alliance for Opportunity, what are some of the things that you all are working on that maybe have a chance to be involved in this Congress, or maybe have to be bigger conversations later? But I'd love to kind of just have an elevated. What are some other cool ideas of reforms and improvements to the safety net, to upward mobility, addressing benefits cliffs and disincentives and those things generally? What are you working on that people ought to know about?
Yeah, so one of the exciting brainstorms that we're working on, that we're working with people in Congress and people in the administration on, is an idea called a super waiver. So like I mentioned before at the top of our conversation, in 1996, states really led the effort. They looked at this program. It was called AFDC, Aid to Dependent Children with Families. It was a massive program. It was the biggest welfare program. And states went to the federal government and they said, hey, we'd really like a waiver to be able to experiment within our program. And one of those experiments was work requirements. There were a couple other experiments that happened. And then because those experiments were successful in moving people to better outcomes, a lot of women, the program was primarily for women or used by women, moved into work and found better mental health outcomes, better economic outcomes, better parenting outcomes for them and their children. It was that success at the state level that really moved towards the 1996 welfare program. So we'd like to really repeat that in these programs. Because just to look back at these programs historically, these aren't, if you tried to design a safety net program, you would never come to how the US safety net program works. It's incredibly siloed. It's incredibly anti-human. You have different eligibility thresholds. So I could qualify for SNAP and I could not qualify for Medicaid, and I could qualify for cash benefits and not qualify for a workforce program, and so on and so forth. Like, it doesn't make sense that the same person in the same situation wouldn't have a cohesive system around them. So what we're trying to do is look at, could we kind of set up the same system that worked, the same experiment that worked in the 90s? Could we empower states to get a Medicaid waiver and a SNAP waiver, a food stamp waiver, and a cash benefit waiver, and a housing waiver, and a workforce waiver, where the state would be able to line up the eligibilities so they make sense for the individual. The state could line up how much federal aid they're getting from the federal side and the federal rules, so they're not constantly spending all of their time jumping through federal hoops. And they could line up how they're reporting back to the federal system. Because remember, this at a state level, they're reporting to at least 5 to 7 different agencies from one department and checking boxes all throughout the day. Some of the boxes make sense, a lot of them don't. So could we have state waivers to experiment with, what does a truly human safety net look like? What does a truly effective safety net system look like? We would love to get this introduced. There are a couple members of Congress who are really interested in getting this idea, fleshing it out, figuring out how to make it work, and getting it introduced and starting to have hearings on this. There's a little bit of flexibility under current law where the administration could say, okay, here's a Medicaid 1115 waiver or a 1915 waiver. Here's a food stamp 2026 waiver. Go and figure out a better system and we're going to sign off on it. They could do that. They haven't said they will yet. So this is what we're trying to look for. We're truly trying to have a state-led safety net innovation waiver process begin.
That ties in really, really well to a lot of the conversations we've been having here in Utah on this issue. Kind of catalyzed in many ways. Late last year, we released a new paper from Sutherland Institute called Strengthening the American Dream that really tried to give a deeper overview of the issue of benefits cliffs, plateaus, or kind of other work disincentive effects that people in the safety net may experience here in Utah. And mainly we drew from a statewide survey of safety net participants in Utah, finding that 77% of the respondents said that they were worried that if they earned more, they would be penalized in a disproportionate way. They'd essentially lose more than they gained from the earnings increase because of the loss of benefits. 62% said they felt stuck in a low-income job because of that. And probably the most striking statistic was 43% of the respondents said that at some point they had taken an action to limit or constrain their economic growth because they were worried about triggering a benefit cliff or a plateau, or otherwise just felt like they were disincentivized from pursuing work opportunities or working more. And so what we've been looking at here in Utah is a pilot program at the state level using TANF funds. That's been an approach and a recommendation that we're, of course, having conversations with the state legislature. And in addition, a resolution that kind of gets maybe more at what you're saying is that this resolution, it had an initial committee hearing and passed. It hasn't been passed fully by the legislature yet. But it essentially articulates this idea that states, and especially Utah, that has a really good track record of being innovative and administering these programs in a really effective way. We in Utah, and presumably other states as well, we want more flexibility from the federal government to be innovative, to try different experiments, different ways to help people move towards work-based self-reliance. So this seems very in line with that. Can you give us a sense of, I guess timing? I'm going to ask you again to predict what's going to happen in Congress, but the state of Utah, if our legislature passes this resolution and if it's signed by the governor, and if other states somehow similarly articulate that, we want state-based flexibility, we would take advantage of a super waiver to build some innovative programs at the state level. Any sense of what is possible at the federal level in Congress? Because I look at it here in Utah and think, man, if to your point of if everyone sat around the table today and we were designing a safety net system, it wouldn't look like the system we have today. So my, I guess, wish or vision is that, well, let's do that. Let's have a state, of course I want it to be Utah, but let's have a state sit down and say, if we were building an ideal system with the objective of creating some stabilizing effects for people who are in a tough spot, while moving them toward work-based self-reliance, And those are very broad objectives, I know. But if we were to build that from scratch today, what would that look like? And in my mind, we kind of, most of our safety net reform conversations, state and national and all over the country, are focused on the incremental improvements. What are the small changes we can make to the existing programs? Those are necessary. We need to keep having those conversations. But I kind of feel like we need two tracks of, yes, the incremental discussion, but let's have a little bit of an aspirational vision conversation. And to your point, if the latter is possible with a super waiver, that'd be really exciting for folks at the state level.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to give a lot of hope here. I think people in Congress and the conversations I've had with congressmen or senators, they recognize the limits of the design that they can come up with here. And so there's a lot when I talk to them and I share what a state has done, that's when the light bulbs go on. That's when they get excited because at the heart of it, they are a representative for their state. They would rather follow good things that their state is doing and then force something on their state. That is how every representative and every senator I've ever met with is. They really want to follow the lead of the states. And so, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it kind of puts the reins in the hands of state actors as much as they have to kind of drive this. And that's hard because, again, the safety net, what is designed for the federal government to come over and take everything. So there are these opposing forces, and we're trying, especially at the Alliance, and I know you're doing the same there in Utah, to make sure that we're really allowing the states to innovate here. It's something we really haven't done substantially in 30 years. And I think that is the path forward. And I think ideas like the pilot that is moving people to work, or a resolution calling on your federal partners to really give you that flexibility. I think those are steps in the path that we need to take. And if we don't take them, I think we're going to be back here in 5 years having the same discussion about little tweaks on the edges of the programs that exist.
Well, the last thing I'll mention, and I would love kind of final thoughts from you, is to your point of if we don't do this, if we're not successful, we're going to have the same discussions and debates 5 years from now. And of course, recognizing that, those of us who want to be champions of opportunity and upward mobility will do whatever it takes for as long as it takes. But when we sit down with families who are experiencing the challenges of trying to move off of the safety net, and we've had them sitting right here in our studio, single moms who are trying to work and earn more, but feel very disincentivized because of, again, whether it's real or perceived benefit cliffs or disincentives or plateaus. And there's a hunger in these families for work and self-reliance and providing a better life for their kids. And I keep thinking about, I have two little kids, my wife and I have two little boys, and if I think, well, I had to wait for 5 years or more to feel like my hard work made more of a difference in their lives than it does now, that'd be really tough. So Washington moves slow, but for the real families affected by some of these policy challenges, there is and ought to be a sense of urgency. I'm just hoping we'll be able to find the right middle ground between those two truths and be able to make some real reforms. And grateful for everything that you're doing and the Alliance is doing to help advance those at the state and federal level.
Well, I share your impatience with the process, and I would just say to and I know those families. I see those families in my own neighborhood and the families that I work with. Um, there is, while it seems like an impossible task, we all know it's one step at a time. I think we've experienced that in our own lives. The next thing does look intimidating, but on a personal level, it is entirely possible. That's honestly what the 96 welfare reform showed us, that there was a lot of trepidation when it passed, that people thought, oh, requiring work or asking people to look for work or volunteer or train, going back to get that education, that's an impossible weight to place on someone's back. And it is a really hard weight. I do not want to diminish the weight that especially single mothers carry for their children. And what we saw after the 96 reform was an incredible flourishing. We saw 20 points gained in employment. We saw mental health, like I said before, like mental health improved and educational outcomes shooting up. So there is, with the work that heavy lift that is being asked of them, there are wonderful outcomes that can happen in the next 5 years. You do not have to wait for the federal government to act. And I think in asking states to act or asking these individuals to act, it's kind of saying, actually, that's the only place it can start. It starts with individual action. It starts with state level action. It starts with local nonprofits acting. And too often, I think the federal government is slow to come, but this is not a sad story. This is a beautiful story and one of hope that we can look at.
Well, we'll end on that hopeful note that we're not waiting for others, maybe in Washington or elsewhere to act. We're doing what we can at the state level. Again, here in Utah, a lot of the work at the Alliance for Opportunity in various states and in Washington. And Les, I just want to thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with us. We'll, of course, continue these conversations and enjoy the further collaboration of Sutherland Institute being an official member of the Alliance for Opportunity as we work together on these issues moving forward. So thank you again for being with us on Defending Ideas.
All right. Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. There's something Les said that really stood out to me that I think should be one of the anchoring principles that we remember really anytime we hear about this issue of possible reforms or even cuts to federal programs like those in the social safety net. And that principle is this: a social safety net that is targeted to those who truly need it, while being agile and responsive to what these families need to escape poverty and move toward work-based self-reliance, could actually be smaller. You often hear people on the political right say that they are small government conservatives. I think another way to think about that a little differently is that government should be lean and targeted and effective at accomplishing specific objectives within its proper authority. In this context, there is certainly room for improvement and reform of the federal social safety net, which spans 80 programs and spends roughly $1.6 trillion a year. But we can and must discuss ways to save taxpayer dollars directly connected with improving outcomes for the people on the margins of society, the people we want the safety net to be able to help effectively. Addressing benefits cliffs, plateaus, or any work disincentive effects that families on the safety net might experience should be central to this discussion. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. And don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share the episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want to have more conversations like this available to you, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.